O a kia noho ia papa hana o moku. Hana o Hawaii he moku, hana o Maui he moku. Hoi ho a kia noho ia ho hoku kalani. Hana o Molokai he moku, hana o Nana e Kaula he moku. Lili o pupuna loa papa ia ho hoku kalani. Hoi ho o papa, noho ia wa kia. Hana o Ahu he moku, hana o Kauai he moku, hana o Nihau he moku. He ula a o ka ho'ola. E aloha mai kako, mai kahi pai, mani na alalo mai kaupuku a ke kahua. Ua waka holi kakalia kiahi, he kumu au ma ki ia kula nui o Kamenaka. Aloha mai kako, I'm Kaholi Kakalia Kiahi Wood, and I'm the Cultural Engagement Specialist here at Shaman University. I was asked by your instructor to give you guys a few videos or some instructions on how Hawaiians divided the land here in Hawaii through the Ahupuaa system and the vowels, or the different divisions vertically, and to talk about the issue over Mauna Kea, why it's important, and why two sides of the argument, view the things the way they do. So we'll cover today the Ahupuaa system in our part 1 video of my TED Talk, and then we'll move on from there. So, do you guys have any questions before we begin? Just kidding, you can't answer any questions anyway. So let's go ahead and get started. But before we go into that, check this sunset out. Mean. Okay, let's begin. So, try to imagine Hawaii 500 years ago. What do you suppose life in the islands was like? How do you think people survived? Different areas of each island were ruled by different chiefs. Umi, son of the great chief of Liloa, was one of these ruling chiefs on the island of Hawaii. In the late 1400s, throughout warfare and alliances with other chiefs, Umi gained control of the rest of Hawaii. Umi made himself a li'inui, or high chief, for the whole island. Umi divided his island into separate moku, or districts. These moku were subdivided into smaller sections called Ahupuaa, and further into ili, and eventually into lele. Like Hawaii, the mokupuni, or islands, of Kauai, Maui, and Oahu were divided into moku. The small islands of Kaho'olawe, Lanai, and Molokai became moku of Maui. The small island of Ni'ihau became a moku of Kauai. These moku were then subdivided into Ahupuaa. Still smaller sections within an Ahupuaa were called ili, strips of land worked by an individual or a family. They often, but not always, lived right on their ili. Thus was born the most important part of land division within Hawaii, the Ahupuaa, a section of land most often running from the mountain to the sea. A typical Ahupuaa was a long strip of land, narrow at its mountain summit tops, and became wider as it ran down the valley into the sea to the outer edge of the reefs. If there was no reef, then the sea boundary would be about 1.5 miles from the shore. Each Ahupuaa had its own name and carefully fixed boundary lines. Often, the markers were natural features such as large rocks or lines of trees, or even the home of a certain bird. A valley Ahupuaa usually used its ridges as boundaries. People living in one Ahupuaa were free to use whatever grew while in the Ahupuaa. But a resident of one Ahupuaa could not take anything from another Ahupuaa. Boundaries were important, and people carefully learned their locations. So we talked about the mokupuni, which is the island. We talked about the moku, which are the different sections in the island, like Honolulu, Kaneohe, Ko'olauloa, Ko'olaupoko, Waianae, so on and so forth. And we also talked about the Ahupuaa, which stretches from the mountain to the sea. For example, Manoa, Kahala. We also talked about the ili, which is like the neighborhood within Ahupuaa, so like Makiki, or like say Kaimoki. And then we also talked about the leles, yeah? So the leles were the different plots of land that people would live on. They weren't always in the same spot, but those were considered that Ohana's Para land. Depending on what they would use it for, like for farming, for living, or for gathering herbs, those would be considered lele. So those are all horizontal land divisions. Let's talk about vertical land divisions. So from the mountain, the ocean, to the sea. So starting from the ocean, we have the kayakea. So let me go show you guys. Okay. So starting from the ocean, we have the kayakea. That's everything out there. Where the ocean touches the sand, that's all kayakea, or that's the kai. And then we have all over here from the shoreline, typically to the mountainside. Yeah, check out these guys. That's known as the waukanaka. So typically that is where it is safe for humans to live, or for Hawaiians to live. There's little chance of erosion, little chance of flood, but high chance of farming practices like lo'ikalo, or you get your lokoi'a, or get your heiau and stuff. If you guys can see, Makupu'u side, you're on heiau over here. Actually, it's on the opposite side, right over there, on that side. Anyway, the heiau over there, or for fishing and gathering and stuff like that. So that's the waukanaka. Then you got the waunahele. You can't see over here because this place is no more forest. But the waunahele, where Hawaiians, if you cannot grow them on your plot of land, or on your lele, or on your ili, then they would go into the waunahele to gather. This is one of the reasons why when Hawaiians switched over to the land division we have today, that it was so difficult, because everything and the concepts were different. Whereas Western thought is you own a specific property, or you own a specific plot of land. Hawaiians viewed it as no one really owned anything, but they malama certain places, or they would care for certain places. And one place was named for the ohana. That place also encompassed like part of the mountain, part of the ocean, and part of the a different side of the mountainside. So when they switched over to the modern concept of land ownership, and they only saw that one name, it was assumed that it was only that part of land that people lived on. So when they tried to go gather in these different areas, and they were told not to, they were like, no. On the piece of paper it says I can do this, but because of the misconception and the miscommunication and the everything, they lost the rights to those specific plots of land. And actually, it became an act of law called Native Hawaiian Gathering Rights, which we will be covering later this semester. So if you're interested in that, let me know, and I can cover that a little bit more than some of the other topics we may be touching on. But anyway, so from the waunahele, we have the wawakua. So the wawakua, you guys cannot see me because I'm kind of too close to the mountain. The wawakua are like the tips of the mountains. So a better example would be like the Ko'olau mountain ranges, yeah? Where the clouds touch the mountains. That's typically said to be where the akuas live, yeah? So the reason lots of locals, lots of the old kupuna, the reason why they don't go to the top of the mountains is because that's where akua lives, that's where the ohane lives, the spirits, the mo'o, or the sacred guardians. And if you don't have permission, or if you don't have a proper reason to go up there, then you most likely won't be leaving there. Which is why, if you look at the news, or if you look at the newspapers and articles, you won't see a lot of it on the news nowadays, because they don't like to promote that. But if you look at the news, there are a lot of hikers that either go missing, that die, or that fall off bridges, never to be seen again. Which is why lots of hiking groups say to wear neon socks. That if you fall over, we can find you because your feet are sticking up. Yeah. But they don't promote that because it's bad for our economy. Yeah. They want people to go hiking, they want people to go Hawaii and not die. But in Hawaiian culture, the wawakua is a place where you're not allowed to go unless you have specific authority or specific reasons, and Akua has spoken to you and allowed you to come in. So anyway, to review, we have the hold on, switch. So we have the kayakea, which is all the ocean, and then we have the waukanaka, where it was safe for kanaka to live, flatlands, all that kind of stuff. Then we have the waunahele, which is the forest side that's safe for gathering or picking your herbs, kind of places where
if you couldn't grow it on your property, you can definitely gather it from the mountains. And then you have your Wawakua. So the tips of the mountains usually where the weather will touch. Yeah. So thinking outside of its spirituality, looking at the Wawakua, these places are typically the most hazardous places on the island. They have super thin ridges, knife-like trails. It's super susceptible to rock slides, to mudslides, especially when it rains. You can't see your footing because of some of the plants up there, some of the usual ferns. It may look safe to walk, but ends up being that the uhe fern grew so thick that what you thought was a safe path ends up being a hole that drops you off the cliff and never to be seen again. So, looking at the Wawakua in more modern day, without the spiritual aspect, those are some of the reasons why we don't allow people to go into the Wawakua. So, should we bring these back? Should we not bring them back? I don't know. What do you think?
And with that, that concludes our first video on the Ahupuaa system and the different vow that we use to divide the land here in Hawaii. If you guys like this video, please hit the like button. Please subscribe. And if you guys have any questions, go ahead and hit the link in the comments below. And if you guys want me to talk about anything in particular relating to the 30-meter telescope for next time's talk, please let me know. Shoot me a DM, and then we'll see if we can collab one of these days. But see you guys soon. Take care. Aloha.